We are all biased. To be human is to be biased. The bias itself is not the problem until it impacts the way we behave and the way we make decisions. But what if we could convert our biases into something that works for us instead of against us? In today's episode, I am joined by Lisa Tromba, author of Mind Knots. Lisa explores with us how cognitive and emotional biases prevent rational leadership. Tromba shares with us practical techniques for elevating awareness of our biases and intentional actions we can all take to get our biases to work for us. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Leadership Project. I'm greatly honoured today to be joined by Lisa Tromba. Lisa is the managing partner and co-founder of Lisa Tromba Associates. And she's also the author of a book called Mind Knots, which talks about psychological bias. And that's what we're going to be discussing today, how cognitive and emotional bias impacts the way that we lead. So I'm very excited about today's conversation. I know that we're going to cover some interesting ground today. So Lisa, without any further ado, I'd love it if you would say hello to the audience. And I'd love to know a little bit about your background and what inspired you to write the book specifically about cognitive and emotional bias.
Good. Well, thank you. And thank you, Mick, for having me. I'm delighted to be here. Yeah, so a little bit about me, my background. I mean, if we go way back, I grew up in a very modest background, blue-collar family. In fact, I think that actually does have a lot to do with why I do what I do and where I am. Because, I grew up in a world where it was quite scripted, right? There was, you're the girl born into the family, you're going to get married, you're going to have children, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. So it was, really quite different. And I always had a very much of a curiosity and a growth mindset. So I always saw beyond those lines, right? And I had to figure out how am I going to get beyond the script of this world in which my circumstances, my childhood. So anyway, I, went to school, I educated myself in the whole thing, and it's been terrific. And so I, channeled my energy, my focus into the leadership space. It's been always interesting to me since I got out of school and went on that path. And, 25 plus years doing this, my core business is executive search. So I'm working with all kinds of leaders from lower to mid-market companies to the Fortune 50, actually, up till that, and all different industries, all different levels, functions, et cetera. There's a lot of years of that diversity, which has been fantastic. So it's given me, it's kind of like my work is my lab, right? It's given me such great insight into everything that can go right or wrong with leadership and sort of, the different personalities and what have you. I also am certified in lots of assessments that I use in my work for clients, certainly at finalist candidate stages. And so that got me a lot smarter about the relationships between what motivates them and what drives them and what how that plays out in their behaviors and their emotions and their personality and all of it coming together. But the real reason that I wrote this book was because over years, and let's take even the past 5 or 6, when leaders are moving on from a position, it's either because they've done well and they've been recruited somewhere else. Okay, so I'll get a call. We need to replace this leader. Sometimes they're moving up or over in their own organization. But most of the time, it's because something's just not right. Something's gone wrong, right? There's a problem that has to be solved. So over the years, I started to, clients would call me with symptoms and they'd say, this is happening, he or she is doing this, it's impacting this, blah, 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 all the residual effects. I started to pay really close attention to the words they were using and the patterns, more importantly, the patterns that I was seeing. And I ended up with like 8 buckets and different clients, different companies, different situations. But I would listen to the story and I'd be like, yep, that goes in the egocentric bucket, right? The root of what's happening appears to be something like an egocentric issue or a control issue or an overly optimistic leader issue, or a risk averse issue. I could go on and on. Anyway, I ended up with 8 buckets. And I thought, okay, there's something here because it's all a different story, but we're coming back to very core foundational themes that are at the root of what's gone wrong. So that's how the book happened. In fact, there are 8 chapters in the book that are focused on each of those 8 buckets of biases. So the book looks at 8 core, but as we all know, I think we all have many biases. So one is never the real problem. It's a mosaic typically that surrounds these biases. So the book addresses, 40 plus biases, but there are 8 core biases. That's how it came to being, because I took 4.5 years of researching and writing and testing and working with leaders and having my network weigh in with their own stories and experiences about cognitive and emotional biases. And that's how the book came to be.
Well, congratulations on your success. There was a really interesting word that caught my attention when you said the word scripted. And I'm going to say you've written your own script and you've broken, let's say, society's script and forged your own path. Where do you think all of these biases start? Because you did say there's a script to follow. You were alluding towards societal biases. Where does it all start, Lisa?
Yeah, I think, listen, there are, as I always say, there are 3 truths to these biases. The first one is it's a human condition. None of us are immune. We all have them, whether we want to admit that or not, we do. So that's number one. The thing about that is, and, these are, again, mental shortcuts, quick responses to some kind of stimulus. But at the end of the day, they become our filter. So they become our mental lens. And that is critical to understand, because if we choose to bury our head in the sand and ignore them, which is a bias called the ostrich effect, by the way, we're doing ourselves a disservice, because we're just saying, oh yeah, no, that doesn't apply to me. That doesn't affect me. But they do. It affects everybody. Now, we all have maybe certain biases that are more prominent in ourselves than they are in others. So my biases, prominent biases, may be very different from what yours might be. So, it's not a plug and play thing we're talking about here. It's quite complex. But so the second truth is it's our mental lens. And, third, we have to acknowledge we can't get rid of them. Like, they cannot be eliminated. They are like hardwired, right? So what can we do? We can manage them. And so that's my sort of point. Be aware of them. They exist. Try to understand them so you can maybe spot them in yourself, spot them in others that surround you, and understand that every single decision, behavior, emotion that happens, there is a bias at the root of it. And so taking that pause, taking that moment to stop and think, we can really preserve ourselves and do the right things, make better decisions, have better relationships. The list goes on.
Yeah, wonderful, Lisa. You've already given us something to stop and reflect on here, is that we are all biased, and we probably need to give ourselves a bit of self-compassion there, that it's natural, it's human nature. The bias itself is not necessarily dangerous until it impacts our behavior or our decision-making. And that's where the awareness comes in. When you notice and name the bias, that's when you can manage it and you can work with it, not against it. So, yeah, really good.
I was going to just add one more thing. I am also very much a believer in, when I look at biases, I look at where's the risk, but I also look at where's the treasure. And we can talk a little bit about that, because there are attributes that tend to be associated with people who have any bias, in any prominent bias, right? And those attributes can show up. And for instance, as a client hiring a leader, they might say, oh, looks great, sounds great, says all the right things, the whole list, because there are positive attributes that we can't overlook. So I look at it as 2 sides. And from a very basic standpoint, mental shortcuts can be very good things when, for instance, you're about to cross the street and a car or truck is charging, there's no time to stop and think. You just respond. Okay, looks like danger. I'm going to step out of the way, right? But the point of my book, Mind Knots, is that in the context of business and leadership, critical thinking is paramount. So generally, defaulting to these urges or influences or mental shortcut responses is not usually going to serve us well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. But I want to unpack this word treasure a little bit more. So can you give us some more examples of where the bias would benefit us as opposed to work against us?
Yeah. So let me use the example of egocentric bias because, leadership is my work. It's your audience. Generally, if you take any position brief for recruiting a leader, let's say, vice president through the C-suite, and you unpack that and you really pay attention to the words in it and the descriptors, at the end of the day, they're powerful words, often drive, persistence, tenacity, able to drive a mission. These are all extremely positive, useful characteristics. And most clients who are hiring the leader, to come in and lead their organization or their mission are looking for those things. Energy, unstoppable energy, move forward quickly. That is what I would call the treasure in egocentrism that we do see in many leaders. Okay, that's a very prominent bias, by the way, right, in leadership. And so on the surface, those things are great. And we want them, and we want to nurture them, and we want to encourage them. When you look at the risk side of the equation, now you're looking at how those things in excess flip to complete individualism or independence, not involving others, making decisions on a leader, making decisions on their own, taking initiative on their own, not having such a strong sense of urgency to drive the mission and get the result. They don't take the time to talk to people, right? So not engaging peers, not conducting really productive decision-making meetings or sessions or thinking processes. And you can even imagine how emotions, right? So we have a leader with a strong egocentric bias who is driving. Emotions can flare easily, right? So this is what I mean. As I say, every leader comes with their biases. It's a package deal. So it's quite important to understand the risk and the treasure. And more important to understand, in this case, we're talking specifically about egocentric bias. Can it be managed? Is this a person who's capable of receiving information and therefore being able to, listen, think, pause, take it in, be coachable, right?
All right, yeah, wonderful, Lisa. So what I'm hearing now, good clarification. So a leader shows up new in the business. That might be through the recruitment process. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But they're entering the business and we look at them. We know before they arrive, they're a human being. Therefore, they will have some kind of bias. And then to unpack, how is that bias going to serve us well and how is it not going to serve us well? And for the parts that are going to serve us well, let's tap into that. Let's encourage that to a certain extent. But with the baggage that comes with it, how are we going to work with that risk? And it may be to surround that leader with people with complementary skills or complementary biases that can help them navigate the business, navigate the world, navigate problems, because they're going to work together. Yeah, it's really interesting, Lisa. So let's get to that selection process. So you're in executive search and executive placement. Bias is riddled in that process. Even before the person showed up for an interview, people are forming views about them based on resume, based on what companies they worked for before, age, gender. All kinds of biases happen even before the interview starts. How do we control that?
Well, it's the same problem, really. The clients who are hiring the leaders are people too. They have their own set of biases, which, and, if let's face it, I say as the leader goes, so goes the organization. So if you have someone leading a company with a very strong fill in the blank bias, chances are it will permeate. I can say likely it will permeate, and people start to mirror the behaviors, the emotions, everything. And so now it becomes systemic. You have a bigger problem than one person's biases. And so in the book, I do address that, that every chapter is 3 sections. First section is, what is the bias? What does it do? What does it look like? Good things, bad things. The middle section is kind of on an individual level, what I call a captain, because the book is written in somewhat of a nautical theme, how the captain can manage their own, because biases are directional, right? They push us toward or pull us away from something, whether it's whatever are the influences of that bias. So we want to know their pushes and pulls, right? So when you think about in the context of hiring, right, those are people too with their whole set of biases. So I'm tuned into that, for instance, when we're meeting to discuss a potential search. I'm listening to the stakeholders to try and assess some informal way what the biases might be that could interfere with the good process and with good assessment and evaluation of candidates. Here's an example. I had a client last year and we were doing a search. This is a Fortune 500 company. And I was suggesting, okay, these are the target companies we'll look at because they resemble a lot in terms of the business model, et cetera, et cetera. He was so against, which is fine, a company on the list. That's fine. It didn't matter to me, but I wanted to understand why. And he just had met one person some point along the way in his career who came from that company. And so his perspective was that they don't turn out good leaders. Now, this is a multi-billion-dollar global organization, right? I think it's unfair to say that, but okay, we won't go there. But that's called, in that case, it's more the horns effect, right? So there's a halo effect bias and there's a horns effect. The horns effect is when you take a simple sample of something like this case and you blow it out of proportion, and all of a sudden it becomes the shadow over a person, a company, a group, whatever. The opposite is the halo effect, where you might meet somebody and say, oh, that person is so smart. That person is so polished and put together and handles themselves well on stage. So they must be also this, right? Now we know rationally that doesn't make sense, right? To make those assumptions. And yet these are biases. These two in particular happen all the time in executive search and selection on the client side of the equation, all the time. So that's to your point, right? That's one example of how it gets in the way. Sometimes leaders hire in their own image. That's very common. So if they see a candidate that maybe even looks like them, but sounds like them, has similar experiences to them, talks like them, follows the same sports team, whatever, that's called hiring in your own image. And that generally doesn't work out in the long term, but nevertheless, it's pretty prevalent. I can tell you that. So yeah, you're right. It happens on both sides of the table.
Yeah. Also, this horns and halo effect is really interesting, and that's what extrapolations are we making? We take one data point, and the example that you're talking about was a single person in probably a organization of tens of thousands, and I'm now forming a view of that person because they worked at company XYZ, and whether that's either positive or negative on the sampling of one is not going to be a very solid extrapolation. So really interesting. And then I'm going to say that confirmation bias will start kicking in there, because then you'll start seeing the things that confirm the judgment that you'd already made. So you'll see the things, I told you, great person. Or I see it, the horns are showing, right? So you'll start noticing the things that confirm the bias that you'd already made. And I'm going to say that that might happen on both sides as well. So in the selection process, I'm going to start with the recruiter and then I'm going to go to the applicant. So from the recruiter point of view, if they've really warmed to the person early and gone, oh, I think this one's a good one, they might start seeing what they want to see. They see the good things and they ignore the red flags. And on the applicant side, if they're really emotionally invested in, oh, yeah, I'd really like this job and I'd like to join this company, because a interview is a two-way process. The applicant should be interviewing the company just as much as the company should be interviewing the applicant. They might start seeing all the things that they want to see in the company and not seeing the red flags of, actually, I'm not sure I do want to join this culture. I'm not sure I do want to join this company. And then 6 months later, when the person's in the company, it may not work out. So tell me what you see as a professional in this area. What do you see around this confirmation bias and people just seeing what they want to see?
Yeah, well, it's huge. And, let's unpack that for a minute. Why does that happen? It happens because we're confirming what our own self filter is packed away inside of us, right? So it's self tunnel vision, right? And we're talking to ourselves. It's one of the things I say is, people say, well, we all want to think we're rational thinkers and we want to believe we're rational thinkers, right? But when you really think about it, like, how could we be? Because our thinking and our thoughts are all based on what's in our personal repository, right? Our own beliefs, a kind of bias, right? BIAS, our own beliefs, our own instincts, our own aversions, and our self that filters all of it, every experience we've ever had. And, we can say, oh, I had that exact experience back, blah, 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 when, but we're human. We don't exactly remember those experiences probably the way they happened. We can misremember, we can misinterpret. So these are all the things that we're now talking to ourselves about, right? So how about we get out of our own head and talk to some other people, right, who have their own personal repository set. But when you can reach out and bring in diverse perspectives, recognizing that we all have our own self filter, you're still in a way better place than when you're talking to yourself. And because rationalizing is exactly where biases can have a ball, because you're just talking to yourself. You're just rationalizing with what you already know. So, yeah. So, when we get into like strategies, how do you manage these things? One of the best strategies is, involve other people. That's why decisions shouldn't be made in silos. In business, we should be looking cross-functionally. We should have other people be weighing in, because maybe there's a chance that someone can change our perspective and that we might be able to see something a little bit differently, whether it's hiring a leader, whether it's just a strategic decision about what a company is going to do, right? The list goes on, right? Which is why I say, biases hijack rational leadership because they get in the way of that rational thinking. And so we have to be very diligent about having things in place that protect us, right? Protect us from ourselves, protect organizations from ourselves, and, that reach out to other people, asking good questions to ourselves and having others ask them too. Putting, 5 steps I talk about: conscious pause, stop and think before you make a decision or you act or you emote. The second thing is, get perspectives. Third, practice intervention strategies. Even if you're constantly questioning yourself or you're putting practices in place where you are literally intentionally practicing, I'm not going to speak until I take a deep breath, count to 5, whatever. That's a very simple example. And then, when that all fails, when someone can't do those things or doesn't pay attention to those things, put processes in place, especially at an organizational level, because this is what we do in business, right? When we want to somehow channel or control behaviors or decisions, we put processes in place so that there's a lane, but it kind of protects you from going beyond to the danger zones. These are things we can do with biases as well. And then number 5 is progress. Check your progress. So I encourage people to pay attention to patterns of their decisions? Are you leaning in one direction all the time? And is it coming back to bite you? Are people saying to you or others, I don't know, like you really keep saying that's a great idea and your optimism's really strong there, but we have evidence that shows maybe it's not such a great idea, right? We should listen. If we hear something enough times, especially from different sources, we should listen because generally that's probably pointing to some sort of bias that we have that may not be serving us well, nor our teams or our organizations. So those are the 5 steps, right? That really someone can make their own, right?
This is a great actionable insight and a takeaway for everyone to pay attention to. So I'll pause at the moment, Lisa, and I'll play back what I'm taking from what I'm hearing from you. First of all, it's around this story that we tell ourselves in our head and how strong that narrative is. And then when we're faced with different stimuli, if it's going to support that narrative or contradict that narrative, it's going to be a big challenge in our brain at that point. One of the things you said a little while ago is about when people start recruiting people in their image, that's going to work against some of that diversity that you spoke about there. So be very acutely aware of this. If you've surrounded yourself with similar experiences and similar ways of thinking, you're then going to have collective confirmation bias where people are going to say, yeah, I agree, same. And there's no diversity of thought in that. And then I'm picking up, and we touched on this very early, Lisa, about the shortcuts that the brain takes, that if we don't do your step 1, which is to stop and pause before we respond, like if we're doing the instant reaction, that instant reaction is almost always going to be based on our bias and our narrative. So stop and pause. That's an intentional act already. Collect diverse inputs from other people, and that's why you need that diversity of thought around you. Make it an intentional practice that you're going to do this. When you can't rely on that, or it's a compounding step, have a process that makes you go through this decision-making process. And then I loved your point about progress, which is to stop and go, okay, well, is it working? What's working? What's not working? What do we need to do differently? As a bit of almost a plan, do, check, act kind of situation where we need to do that checking to make sure that our processes and our practices are serving us well. And all of that 5-step stage that you said is not autopilot. This is intentional stuff. How does that sit with you, the summary?
Excellent. And, I love something that you said earlier too, which is another strategy, right, for a leader is to have an accountability partner. And ideally, the accountability partner should be someone that leans in the opposite direction. So if you are an overly optimistic leader, again, great treasure in that and great risk. Find a business partner that leans on the other side, that's pretty pessimistic. I call it defensive pessimism is what you want, right? Because that person should be your best friend, because that person, can give you enough, maybe insights, alert you to some risks that you're not paying attention to, signs you're ignoring, and you meet, right? That is the whole premise of the big picture of the book, is to flip these mind knots from mental shortcuts that can get you in trouble to strategic assets. So the book, again, is in a nautical theme. So I say, know your knot. Know the knots that can tie you down and know the knots that can give you speed and move you forward. So it's a play on the word knots from a nautical perspective, but that is the truth of it. We can, if you choose to pay attention and become aware, understand, recognize, practice intervention strategies, and just be alert and diligent, you can flip these into strategic assets. And it might be with the help of a strong accountability partner who has a counter bias that can be helpful to both of you, or it's the 5-step process. But there's, many ways to come at it. We could talk a long time, but we don't have the time to do that. But, you're absolutely right. That was an excellent point. And, the other thing about stopping and pausing. So here's a question that anybody can use. You don't have to understand biases, though I hope you will, now have some awareness and try to pay attention to these things. But here's a question that really is universal. And I've used it with my children, raising them, people I coach, my executives. I have it written on a blackboard in my kitchen as a daily reminder. And the question is, who am I practicing becoming? Because we're all on a journey. And I don't care how old you are, what stage of life you're in, doesn't matter, right? We are on a journey and we're becoming somebody every day, hopefully a little bit better tomorrow than we are today, right? That's the point. So the question is future focused, but I don't want anybody to think about it that way, because the answer to the question happens in the moments of every day. Because every day we are challenged with a situation, a response, a comment, and that requires a reaction. And if we can just say to ourselves at the beginning of every day, who am I practicing becoming? And try to hold that thought in our head as we go through our life and our business and all of it, or ask ourselves that question when we are in a position where we've got to make a response, I think it can help. It at least gives you a fighting chance to think before, deciding or acting, because these things will influence the decisions we make and the actions we take. So we need to pay attention.
Yeah, it's a really powerful question, Lisa. So that's one for everyone listening right now. So who are you practicing becoming? And this supports this concept of writing your own narrative. And then you can, in your decision making, in your behaviors, you can then make some decisions about, well, is this decision or is this behavior congruent with the person that I'm becoming? Yes or no? And that can be a very powerful intentional act at that point. This has been wonderful so far, Lisa. I want to get into, you mentioned earlier 40 biases in the book, but you mentioned 8 core biases. So let's unpack that a little bit more. Tell us about the 8 core biases that we need to be aware of.
Sure. So egocentric bias we've talked about. I talk about another bias, curse of knowledge, which we typically see in business all the time. We're dealing with experts in one thing or another. And oftentimes when people have gotten to that expert space, the knots in their mind are all that knowledge that's tightly wound and stuck. But what good is it unless it can be transferred and turned into something productive, right? An idea, a product, a service, whatever. So it's really at the core of it is really about communication, right? So the curse of knowledge bias will prevent someone from being able to distill that knowledge or information into something that people who don't have that level of expertise or knowledge can understand and consume and work with. Optimism bias, belief bias, intuition bias. And I mentioned optimism. These are all biases I address. And then finally, the last one is planning fallacy. Every business has plans, right? And that's a big one because some people get so caught in the planning that they can't get to the action, they can't get to the execution. And planning bias is really rooted in optimism. It's why most of the time when we put plans together, well, they don't actually go according to plan. Why? Because we've underestimated time, cost, resources, risk, and we've overestimated the outcome and what we think, how do we think this plan's going to unravel and go? And it usually doesn't go that way. So these are the core biases that, over the years have been at the root of many of the leadership searches problems I've needed to solve. And so I do think they're prevalent. And I think they're more prevalent to certain people than others. But nevertheless, they're important. And the 40 plus biases that you referred to in the book are connected, not all of them, but some of them, certain biases connect with illusion of control bias, for instance. So if you have a strong illusion of control, thinking you can control things you really can't, you tend to also have optimism kind of pushing behind that, encouraging you to believe that is true. Then you have a belief bias also nudging, right? And when all of a sudden you have this mosaic of what I call colluding biases that conspire to really mess us up, right? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm seeing that one for sure. And I've got to say, I'm privately reflecting on this on myself and going, yes, I think I've done that in the past. And this compounding effect, and before you know it, you've convinced yourself of something that's not really true, but you've convinced yourself in a compounding way. The big takeaway I'm taking, Lisa, is about understanding our biases and getting them to work for us instead of against us. That's a big takeaway for me. But then also surrounding ourselves with complementary people that might balance that. So when I was listening to you talk about some of those different examples, we already spoke about the optimism. So if you've got optimism bias, maybe have someone around you that's a little bit more risk averse that can be in your other ear and listen to each other, by the way, in doing this now, because you'll find the common ground and make a more sound decision if you've considered both sides, the optimistic side and also the risk-averse side. You spoke about the cursive knowledge bias. You need those people. You need those people with deep knowledge of their craft, but they may be so deep in that complexity that they don't know how to put it into action. So you might need someone that can help them untangle that knot and to simplify the complex. So you need that person with that deep knowledge or you're going to be in trouble. But if you get bogged down in the detail, you may never come out the other end. So you need someone that can unthread that with them and simplify the complex. You said about the planning bias, you might need someone that's very action-oriented sitting next to that planning bias person. And then we can start taking advantage of the strengths, but also minimizing the baggage that comes along with some of those strengths. How does that sit with you?
That's exactly right. And I don't know if you read the book or not, but that's exactly it. So my counter bias for planning is the action bias. Counterbalance actually for cursive knowledge is simplification. So yeah, right out of the book. And there's more biases I talk about that can be helpful in all of these things. But the two key points, like at a higher level, if we step it up to the high level here of what you're saying, which is on point, there's two ways to look at this. We first have to worry about kind of managing these things on an individual level. But really in business, they don't stay there. They don't stay there. Biases are pervasive, whether it's directly or through mirroring or mimicking actions and decisions, et cetera. So it becomes very quickly a compounding problem that can go really off the rails, right? Which is why we have to think about this in a broader perspective of systemic, right? What can businesses put in place? Because I don't know, like in a consulting business, for instance, right? You can tend to see a lot of individualists, a lot of people that are lean toward the egocentric because these are really smart people that have something to say and can solve problems. And it becomes a culture bias, right? So if you think about, I don't know, I don't want to name any names of companies because I love them. I love these consulting companies, but you can see it. It becomes a cultural bias. So I talk in terms of not just being bias aware for ourselves as in leadership and in life, but creating bias aware cultures, because that's where the risk really is when, bias aware cultures are created and not managed.
I've definitely seen that in my career as well, Lisa. There's no doubt about that it becomes almost part of the identity of that organization of, oh, we would never do something like that around here. And no one's challenged it for years because it's become ingrained. Some of the biases that might come along, whether it's a risk aversion bias, it could be exactly that, right? So yeah, really interesting. So we've got a number of takeaways from today's discussion, Lisa. I want to play back the key ones for me. The first one, I love this question about who am I practicing becoming? And then we can really critically assess and just have a look at, are our behaviors, our actions, our decisions congruent with that person that we're practicing becoming or not? That's a great self-check-in that you can do every day to make sure that you're on the right track. Then to understand our biases and surround ourselves with people that might have the balancing bias so that we can make those better decisions. And then to have this 5-point kind of intentional practice that we stop and we pause before we act or decide, that we collect those diverse ideas and perspectives, that we intentionally practice this, that we have processes that support it, and that we then check our progress and we self-reflect what's working, what's not working, what do we need to do differently. I think that's a wonderful 5-point plan to make sure that we're not on autopilot, that we're not taking the brain's natural shortcuts, and that we're in instant reaction mode instead of considered response mode. And those considered response across those 5 steps that you spoke about, Lisa. I think that's a wonderful takeaway for our audience to really think about how, if you're on the tram or driving your car on your way to work today, think about those 5 points. Think about the person you're practicing becoming. Think about your own biases and whether you've got people around you that have complementary biases, so that you can take advantage of the strengths of those biases but minimize the baggage that comes with those biases. Some really wonderful takeaways, Lisa. I'd like to now take us to our rapid round. So these are the same 4 questions that we ask all of our guests. So what's the one thing that you know now, Lisa Tromba, that you wish you knew when you were 20?
Yeah. You know what? I think I have to just say, I wish I knew more about biases. I could have saved myself a lot of trouble, right? I mean, they get us in trouble. And so, yeah, I wish I knew more about it then.
Yeah,
or I was, aware.
I think all of us can probably nod our head on that one, go, yeah, that's true. It's one of those things that takes a while to learn. And actually, to touch on something you said before, I think most 20-year-olds do not know, that's unfair, that's bias there already actually. Most 20-year-olds do not consider that we make decisions emotionally and we justify them rationally. That also takes time for us to realize as well. And that's related. Yeah. Okay, very good. What's your favorite book?
I love to read. I have a lot of favorites, but I guess I'm going to pick one. It's called Range by David Epstein. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's a phenomenal book. And so, listen, my work in executive search is in the world of people moving from being generalists in search to specialists, right? So this book, meaning, if you, are you a generalist and you can do any search, any leadership search in any industry, any function, versus people who go in one lane and go deep, specialists, right? There was a movement in search where, you didn't want to be a generalist anymore. You needed to be a specialist, right? To serve the market and clients better. But the book Range is the opposite. It's definitely, the message is, contrary to popular belief, specializing early does not usually serve us well, right? And so the research that in the book that supports it is that, looking at, vast amounts of different people who are experts in one space or another, that distill down to this message, which is the research shows that people who have cross-domain experience tend to be way more creative, more agile, and they can see connections that specialists will never see. The reason I love the book is because it resonates with me. My entire career, I have been a generalist, which has been treasure for me because I've a track record in working across industries, across different business models, sizes of companies, recruiting across different functions of leaders. And later in my career, I did somewhat channel that in and specialize because I was forced to within the confines of a firm. And had I not been a generalist for all those years and had that track record, I would never have been able to creatively solve the searches that I've solved. So I am a big fan of that cross-domain experience because it just, at the end of the day, makes you a better problem solver because you've seen things that other people haven't seen, and you can make the connection about what you can draw upon to solve a problem, whatever that problem might be. So I love the book Range. I highly recommend it. I don't know. I mean, I guess I don't know if it's my favorite from the perspective of my career, but I love it. There are many other books I could talk about.
Yeah, wonderful, Lisa. I'm going to share a personal reflection back on that listening to you because I feel the same. To be clear, there's multiple paths towards any successful executive career. Okay, so there's no one path, but my experience is similar to yours, Lisa. So in my background, I've been an engineer. I've been a quality manager, a bid manager, a project manager. I've been a head of sales and marketing. I've done all kinds of jobs, and I think it does make me a better executive today. But I also know my strengths and I know my weaknesses, and then I surround myself with people that so I'm not a detailed. I can interpret a P&L without any detail, but never ask me to prepare the P&L and the numbers underneath it and get into the spreadsheet. I just do not have that skill set. I can interpret the result, but I can't build the P&L in the first place. So I surround myself with people that can do that. So I do think that general experience makes me a stronger leader today, but that doesn't mean that you can't go the other path. And I would say that I've probably landed in a situation where I'm more T-shaped, where I do have some deep expertise in one field, but then I've had experience across multiple fields. And I do think it does make you a better problem solver because, first of all, you have empathy. So if an engineer comes to me with a problem, guess what? I'm an engineer and I can roll my sleeves up and I can go back and empathize with them and help them.
Yeah. And listen, we do need specialists. And I guess the point is maybe just don't go there so early, right? Give yourself that breadth of experience and then choose where you are a specialist and then go deep, right? That's more along the lines of where the book ends up. But giving yourself that chance to be curious and try and experiment and learn and grow, very useful.
Yeah, love it. All right. What's your favorite quote?
I would say it's a quote by Vince Lombardi, who was an NFL coach. And you know what? I want to get it right. So hold on.
Take your time.
Because I can say what it means, but I want to say the quote true to the way he said it. So let me find it here. Okay. A measure of a person is what they do with what they have, right? Which is why I wanted to make sure I said it precisely right. So the essence of that is that, we're not all blessed or born into traits or whatever, but when you can really assess kind of where you are, whether in your station of life, your resources, your, intelligence, your skills, your talent, whatever, when you can really assess that well and make the most of you with what you have to work with and build on it, of course, if you choose to, that I do think speaks to the measure of a person. So, and I connect that to kind of like circle back to my beginning story about my life, where, I didn't have a lot to work with from a circumstances situation. But I recognized that I had these things going on in me, in my head, my curiosity, my want to advance, my want to learn, all of that. And so I think it's when you can recognize that and do the best you can do with those things that you know in yourself and then build on them. I think that really is what makes people successful and makes and interesting and more importantly, feel a personal sense of success and satisfaction because you've leveraged what you had to work with, right?
Yeah, I really like it. And to me, it's the essence of a creator mindset versus a victim mindset. So a victim mindset will blame the situations. They'll think about what they didn't have instead of what they did have. And a creator mindset will make the most of any situation with whatever cards they were dealt with. Yeah, so yeah, really good. Love it. All right, now finally, Lisa, there's going to be people listening to this show that are deeply interested in knowing more about this concept of bias or deeply interested in you and your work. So how do people find you if they'd like to know more?
Yeah, I suppose the easiest way is on LinkedIn. So Lisa Tromba on LinkedIn. If people want to take a little bit more of a deeper dive into my knots, of course, the book is on Amazon. And I did create a companion website for informational purposes, really to continue the work of the book. So the website continues to grow with more information, but that is mindknots.co. And it kind of does a quick review of different chapters in the book, but it also does explore the 40 plus biases that you referred to. So it's just more information, good information, if somebody can visit that too.
All right. Wonderful, Lisa. Well, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your wisdom, experience and insights. You've certainly given us a lot to stop and reflect on. And I feel richer for having this conversation. So thank you so much.
Excellent. Good. Well, thank you for having me. This has been great. I enjoyed the discussion. And I do hope that, your audience will get some really good nuggets of takeaways. Thank you.
You've been listening to The Leadership Project. In our next episode, I'll be sharing my personal leadership reflections on Lisa's interview, together with other leadership lessons from my personal life and the world around us. This is part of our new format of the show. Each week, we bring you a thought-leading expert in the field of leadership, high performance, and psychology on Tuesday, and each Friday, we bring you the weekly leadership reflections. If you are finding our content to be valuable, we would greatly appreciate it if you would leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast service. You can also subscribe to the Leadership Project YouTube channel, where we bring you video podcasts, curated videos, and our weekly live streams covering the how-to of leadership, so you can become the high-performance leader you wish you always had. Thank you for listening to The Leadership Project at mixbeers.com. A huge call out to Faris Sadek for his video editing of all of our video content, and to all of the team at TLP. Joanne Goes On, Gerald Calabo, and my amazing wife, Say Spears. I could not do this show without you. Don't forget to subscribe to the Leadership Project YouTube channel, where we bring you interesting videos each and every week. And you can follow us on social, particularly on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Now, in the meantime, please do take care, look out for each other, and join us on this journey as we learn together and lead together.